I inherited a crumbling textile factory from my late husband. For 3 years, I poured every ounce of myself into keeping it alive. My son worked alongside me, learning the business from the ground up, believing in our vision for the future. But when he brought home his fiancée from one of the wealthiest families in the city, I smiled and welcomed her with open arms. I never suspected that behind her perfect manners and designer clothes lay a plan to destroy everything we had built. The day I discovered their scheme, I was standing in my own living room. What I overheard would turn my world inside out. But instead of breaking down, I did something they never expected. I smiled, because sometimes the best revenge is letting people think they've already won. But before we begin, please leave us a comment telling us which state or city you're watching from. And please don't forget to like and subscribe so this channel can grow and bring you more compelling stories. My name is Shanice. If you had told me 5 years ago that I would be running a textile manufacturing business, I would have laughed until I cried. I was a high school English teacher for 23 years, a woman who knew her way around lesson plans and parent-teacher conferences, not production schedules and supply chain management. But life has a way of reshaping you when you least expect it, molding you into someone you never imagined becoming. My husband, Bernard, was the businessman in our family. He inherited the factory from his father, a small operation that specialized in custom fabrics for boutique fashion houses and interior designers. It wasn't glamorous, and it certainly wasn't making us rich, but it was honest work. Bernard loved it with a passion that bordered on obsession. He would come home late, smelling of dye and machine oil, his eyes bright as he told me about a new order or a technique he wanted to try. I loved him for that passion, even when it meant eating dinner alone with our son, even when it meant he missed school plays and birthday parties. When Bernard died suddenly of a heart attack at 52, the world tilted sideways. I remember standing in the factory office, surrounded by filing cabinets and dusty ledgers, thinking this was all a terrible mistake. The funeral was on a Friday, and by Monday morning, I knew I had two choices. I could sell the factory, probably for pennies on the dollar, given its struggling state, or I could figure out how to run it myself. My son, DeShawn, was 23 then, fresh out of college with a business degree he hadn't quite figured out how to use. He looked at me across Bernard's old desk and said, "Mom, we can do this. Dad would want us to try." So we tried. God, how we tried. Those first 2 years were brutal. I learned about production costs and profit margins, about the difference between cotton sateen and cotton percale. I learned about how to negotiate with suppliers who thought a middle-aged widow would be easy to cheat. I learned how to manage a workforce of 32 people, most of whom had known Bernard for years and weren't sure this school teacher could fill his shoes. DeShawn threw himself into it with the same intensity his father had, working 16-hour days, sleeping in the office when orders ran late. We made mistakes. We lost clients. We had months where making payroll meant I didn't take a salary, where DeShawn and I ate rice and beans for dinner and pretended it was a choice, not a necessity. But slowly, painfully, we started to turn things around. I discovered I had a knack for the creative side, for understanding what designers wanted before they fully articulated it. DeShawn modernized our equipment, brought in computerized systems that made us more efficient. By the third year, we were stable. Not thriving, not expanding, but stable. We were making our loan payments on time. Our workers had steady employment. We had a handful of loyal clients who appreciated our quality and reliability. It wasn't the empire Bernard had dreamed of building, but it was ours, and we had kept it alive through sheer stubborn determination. That's when DeShawn met Nicolette. He came home one evening with a look I hadn't seen on his face since he was a teenager with his first crush. "Mom," he said, sitting across from me at our small kitchen table, "I met someone." The way he said it, soft and wondering, made my heart warm. My son had sacrificed so much for the factory, for our survival. He deserved happiness. He deserved love. "Tell me about her," I said, setting down my mug of tea. His face lit up. Her name was Nicolette Beaumont. She worked in marketing for a luxury retail company. They had met at an industry networking event that DeShawn had forced himself to attend, even though he hated those things. "She's different, Mom," he said, his voice earnest. "She's smart and funny, and she actually understands what we do. She's interested in the business side of fashion, the manufacturing process." We talked for 3 hours. Over the next few months, I watched my son fall deeply, completely in love. He brought Nicolette to the factory to show her the operation, introduced her to our key workers, explained our processes with pride. She asked intelligent questions, took genuine interest, smiled at me warmly whenever we met. She was beautiful, certainly, with smooth dark skin, natural hair she wore in elaborate styles, and an elegance that came from generations of money, because the Beaumonts had money, serious old money. Her father, Reginald Beaumont, owned a portfolio of commercial real estate across the region. Her mother, Vivian, sat on the boards of half a dozen cultural institutions. They lived in one of those historic mansions in the old money district, the kind of house that gets featured in architectural magazines. When DeShawn told me he wanted to propose, I was thrilled. When he told me he'd already asked for her parents' blessing and received it, I felt a flutter of something I couldn't quite name. Not concern exactly, but something close to it. "They were great," DeShawn assured me when he saw my expression. "They said they were happy their daughter found someone with such strong work ethic and family values." The words were perfect. Too perfect, perhaps. But I pushed the feeling aside. I was being paranoid, letting old insecurities about class and money cloud my judgment. The Beaumonts had welcomed my son, that was what mattered. The engagement party was held at the Beaumont mansion, and I felt out of place the moment I walked through the door. Everything gleamed with the kind of wealth that doesn't announce itself because it doesn't need to. The floors were original hardwood, probably 200 years old. The furniture was antique but immaculately maintained. Servers in crisp uniforms circulated with champagne and canapes. I wore my best dress, the one I'd bought for Bernard's funeral and hadn't worn since, and I felt like an imposter. Vivienne Beaumont greeted me with air kisses that never quite touched my cheeks. "Shanice, how lovely that you could make it," she said, her voice dripping with the kind of politeness that feels like an insult. "DeShawn speaks so highly of you." "As he should," I replied, keeping my voice warm. "I'm his mother." "Of course," Vivian continued, her smile never wavering. "It must be so difficult managing that little factory all by yourself. So brave of you to keep it going." "Little factory?" The word stung, though I kept my face neutral. Our factory employed over 30 people. It generated nearly $2 million in annual revenue. It was small compared to the Beaumont empire, certainly, but it was far from insignificant. "We manage," I said simply, "and we're very proud of what we've built." "Oh, I'm sure," Vivian agreed, in that tone that suggests the opposite. "It's so important to have projects, isn't it? Keeps one busy." Projects. As if Bernard's legacy, as if the 3 years of backbreaking work DeShawn and I had poured into survival was just a hobby to pass the time. Reginald Beaumont was smoother, more subtle. He shook my hand with a firm grip and looked me directly in the eye. "Mrs. Shaw," he said, "DeShawn is a fine young man. You should be very proud." "I am," I said, meaning it completely. "He's worked incredibly hard." "That's evident," Reginald agreed. "Nicolette tells us about the factory, about your operation. Textiles is a challenging industry these days with all the overseas competition." "It is," I acknowledged, "but there's still a market for quality American-made fabrics, especially for designers who value craftsmanship." "Absolutely," he said, though his expression suggested he thought I was being optimistic to the point of delusion. "Though I imagine it's quite capital-intensive keeping equipment modern, competing with larger operations." There. It was so casual I almost missed it. The probe, the assessment. He was sizing up our financial situation, determining whether we were an asset or a liability to his daughter's future. I smiled and changed the subject, but the interaction left a sour taste in my mouth. I watched DeShawn and Nicolette together that evening, watched how she touched his arm, laughed at his jokes, looked at him with what seemed like genuine affection. I watched the Beaumonts watch them, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was missing something, that there was a layer to this situation I couldn't quite see. But DeShawn was happy, happier than I'd seen him since before his father died. That had to count for something. That had to be enough. The wedding was 6 months away, and the planning consumed everyone's attention. Vivian took charge with military precision, hiring the best vendors, choosing the most exclusive venue, making decisions with the kind of casual expenditure that made my head spin. I offered to contribute what I could, a gesture that was politely declined. Don't be silly, Vivian said, waving a perfectly manicured hand. The bride's family traditionally covers the wedding, and we want to give our daughter the celebration she deserves. Our daughter, not the couple or the newlyweds. Our daughter, as if DeShawn was merely an accessory to Nicolette's special day. But I held my tongue and played my assigned role, showing up for dress fittings and menu tastings, smiling and nodding at choices that had already been made. It was 2 months before the wedding when things started to shift, subtly at first, then with increasing obviousness. Nicolette began coming to the factory more often, always with her tablet, always asking questions. I'm just trying to understand the business better, she explained when I expressed surprise at her frequent visits. I want to be able to support DeShawn, and that means understanding what he does all day. It seemed reasonable, thoughtful even. She asked about our client list, our production capacity, our equipment maintenance schedules. She reviewed our financial statements with DeShawn, claiming she wanted to help modernize our accounting systems. I work with budgets and projections all the time in my job, she told me with a bright smile. I might be able to offer some insights. DeShawn was thrilled. See, Mom, he said to me one evening after Nicolette had left. She really gets it. She's not just marrying me, she's invested in our whole future in the business. I wanted to share his enthusiasm. I tried to, but something felt off. The questions were too detailed, too probing. The interest felt less like support and more like reconnaissance. I told myself I was being ridiculous, letting my insecurities about the class difference between our families make me suspicious of genuine care. Nicolette was going to be my daughter-in-law. She had every right to understand the business that would be part of her married life. I needed to let go of my paranoia and trust my son's judgment. Then came the evening that changed everything. It was a Thursday, late, around 8 o'clock. I had gone home earlier, but realized I'd left my reading glasses in the factory office. I drove back, using my key to enter through the side door, not bothering to turn on all the lights since I knew exactly where I'd left the glasses. I was halfway down the hallway to the office when I heard voices. The door to the conference room was slightly ajar, light spilling out into the dark corridor. I recognized DeShawn's voice immediately. He was speaking in that tone he used when he was stressed, when he was trying to convince himself of something. I just don't know, Nick. It feels wrong, not telling her. Baby, we've been over this. Nicolette's voice was soothing, patient. Your mother is too emotionally attached to the factory. She won't see the bigger picture. I froze, my hand reaching for the door to announce my presence stopped mid-air. Something in Nicolette's tone made me step back into the shadows instead. But it's her business, too, DeShawn argued. Dad left it to both of us. She's put everything into keeping it alive. And that's exactly why she can't be objective, Nicolette replied. Shanice sees the factory as a memorial to your father, not as a business asset. She'll never agree to sell it, no matter how much sense it makes. Sell it. The words hit me like a physical blow. I pressed my back against the wall, my heart hammering so hard I was afraid they would hear it. My father has been very clear about the opportunity here, Nicolette continued, her voice taking on a harder edge. The property alone is worth nearly $2 million in the current market. The equipment, if sold separately, could bring in another $300,000 to $400,000. The client list and brand have value to a larger competitor. We're talking about 3 to 3.5 million total. That's not what the factory means, DeShawn said, but his voice was weaker now, wavering. It's Dad's legacy. Your father's legacy is you, Nicolette said firmly. Not a building, not some machines. You. And right now, you're trapped in a business that's barely breaking even, that consumes all your time and energy, that's preventing you from reaching your full potential. We're doing okay, DeShawn protested. We're stable now. Stable isn't success, Nicolette countered. DeShawn, my father is offering you an executive position in his real estate company, six-figure salary, benefits, real growth potential. But he needs to know you're serious, that you're not going to be distracted by trying to keep this factory running. The sale needs to happen before the wedding. There was a long pause. I could hear my son breathing, could imagine his face, the way it looked when he was being torn in two directions. And my mom? He asked finally. What happens to her? She'll have her share of the sale proceeds, Nicolette said, as if this solved everything. $1.5 million. That's more than she'd make from the factory in 10 years of operation. She can retire comfortably, travel, finally relax after all these years of stress. DeShawn, we'd be doing her a favor. She won't see it that way. Not at first, Nicolette agreed. That's why we need to present this carefully. My father's lawyers have been reviewing the corporate structure. Since you own 51% as Bernard's primary heir, you have controlling interest. Technically, you can approve the sale without your mother's consent. The world tilted. I gripped the wall to stay upright, my fingernails digging into the plaster. I can't do that to her, DeShawn said, but even I could hear the uncertainty in his voice. She'd never forgive me. She will, Nicolette insisted. Once she sees how much better your life becomes, once she realizes she's free from the burden of the factory, she'll understand. And DeShawn, baby, listen to me. My parents have been very generous about the wedding, about welcoming you into the family, but my father isn't going to invest in someone who's drowning in a failing business. He needs to see that you're capable of making smart decisions, of putting your future first. Your father said that? Not in those exact words, Nicolette admitted. But the message was clear. This marriage is an opportunity for you, for us, to build something real. But you have to be willing to let go of the past. I heard movement, footsteps. I need to think about it, DeShawn said. There's not much time to think, Nicolette replied, her voice taking on an urgent quality. The buyer my father found is ready to move now. The offer is good for 2 weeks. After that, it's off the table. We need to act quickly before your mother catches wind of any of this and tries to block it. I just need a few days, DeShawn pleaded. Please, Nick. This is huge. I need to process it. Fine, Nicolette said, and I heard the click of her heels approaching the door. But DeShawn, you need to decide. Are you going to spend your life maintaining your father's struggling legacy, or are you going to build your own future with me? I barely made it back down the hallway and out the side door before they emerged from the conference room. I sat in my car in the dark parking lot, gripping the steering wheel, my whole body shaking. Not from fear, not from sadness, from rage. Pure, incandescent rage. Everything clicked into place with devastating clarity. The detailed questions about the business, the frequent visits, the casual access to our financial records. Nicolette hadn't been learning to support DeShawn. She'd been gathering intelligence for her father. They had been planning this, strategizing how to acquire our property, our business, our legacy, with my own son as their unwitting accomplice. And the cruelest part was how they'd framed it not as theft, but as help, as an opportunity, as liberation. I drove home in a daze, my mind racing. I thought about confronting them immediately, bursting back in and demanding answers. I thought about calling DeShawn, screaming at him for even considering this betrayal. But something stopped me. Maybe it was 23 years of teaching teenagers, of learning that direct confrontation often entrenched people in their positions rather than changing their minds. Maybe it was 3 years of learning to be a businesswoman, of understanding that emotion, while valid, was rarely an effective strategy. Or maybe it was something deeper, some instinct I didn't fully understand yet. Whatever it was, I kept my mouth shut. I went home, made myself a cup of tea I didn't drink, and sat in my dark living room thinking. They thought I was too emotional to be objective. They thought I saw the factory as nothing more than a memorial to Bernard. They thought I was an obstacle to be managed, a problem to be solved, preferably without my knowledge or consent. They thought they were so much smarter than me, so much more sophisticated, that they could dismantle my life while convincing me it was for my own good. The rage crystallized into something colder, harder, something focused. They wanted to play games with my son's future, with my husband's legacy, with my life. Fine, we'd play games, but they were about to learn that underestimating a middle aged woman who had survived 3 years in a cutthroat industry was a very serious mistake. I didn't sleep that night. I sat at my kitchen table with a legal pad, writing and crossing out, planning and revising. By dawn, I had the skeleton of a strategy. It was risky. It required perfect timing. It meant letting them think they were winning right up until the moment I revealed they'd already lost. But it could work. It had to work, because I wasn't just fighting for a factory anymore. I was fighting to save my son from making the biggest mistake of his life, from selling his soul to people who saw him as nothing more than a useful asset. And I was fighting to show the Beaumonts that their wealth and connections didn't make them untouchable, that there were some things money couldn't buy, and some people who couldn't be manipulated. The first step was information. If the Beaumonts had been researching us, it was time I returned the favor. I called in sick to the factory the next morning, something I never did, and drove to the downtown library. I wasn't technologically sophisticated enough to do deep internet research, but I knew how to use public records, how to look up property transactions and business filings. I spent 6 hours going through documents, taking notes, building a picture of Reginald Beaumont's business empire. What I found was illuminating. On the surface, everything looked solid. But when you dug deeper, when you looked at the patterns of buying and selling, a different story emerged. Reginald specialized in acquiring undervalued properties, usually from desperate sellers or those who didn't know what they actually owned. He'd buy low, often from widows or family businesses in transition, then hold the property for a few years before flipping it at massive profit. It was legal, entirely legal, but it was predatory in the way that staying just inside the lines of the law often is. He had a particular talent for finding businesses in transition, for befriending the owners, for offering help and guidance, right up until the moment he made his move. 3 years ago, he'd acquired a small commercial building from an elderly couple for half of what it was actually worth. 2 years before that, a warehouse complex from a family in the midst of a state settlement. The pattern was clear, and it made me sick. This was what he did, this was his model. And my son, my business, was just his latest target, but I found something else too, something that made my pulse quicken. Two of Reginald's recent acquisitions were now sitting empty. He'd bought the properties, displaced the existing businesses, and then failed to find new tenants. The properties were generating no income, just expenses. For a man whose wealth looked impressive on paper, he had a surprising amount of leverage, a surprising amount of debt. He was playing with other people's money, using borrowed capital to fund his acquisitions. It was a house of cards, stable only as long as every deal worked out, as long as he could keep flipping properties at a profit. One bad deal, one property that didn't sell or rent, and the whole structure wobbled. I left the library with a thick folder of photocopies and a growing sense of possibility. That night, I went through our factory's corporate documents, really read them for the first time since Bernard's death. He had structured the ownership carefully. I had 49%, DeShawn had 51%, giving him controlling interest. But there were clauses I'd forgotten about, provisions Bernard had included to protect the business. Any sale of the company or its assets required not just majority approval, but also unanimous approval from all board members. And the board consisted of 3 people: me, DeShawn, and our longtime production manager, Marcus. Marcus had worked for Bernard for 18 years. He was loyal to the bone, and he had as much invested in the factory's survival as I did. Even if DeShawn voted to sell, I could block it. The Beaumont's lawyers had either missed this detail or were counting on being able to pressure Marcus into compliance. Either way, it was a weapon I could use. But I didn't want to just block the sale. That would solve the immediate problem, but wouldn't address the larger issue. DeShawn was being manipulated by people who saw him as a means to an end. Nicolette was marrying him not despite his connection to a valuable property, but because of it. If I simply prevented this particular scheme, they would find another way. They would wait, bide their time, work on him until they wore down his resistance. No, I needed to do more than defend. I needed to attack. I needed to expose the Beaumonts for exactly what they were, and I needed to do it in a way that would wake DeShawn up without destroying him in the process. The second step in my plan required help, and for that, I needed to swallow my pride and reach out to someone I hadn't spoken to in almost 2 years. Terrence Bryant had been Bernard's lawyer and close friend. When Bernard died, Terrence had helped me navigate the estate issues, had offered to continue representing the business, but his fees were expensive, and in those early days of financial crisis, I'd thanked him and told him I couldn't afford to keep him on retainer. We'd parted on good terms, but I'd been too proud to stay in touch, too embarrassed by our reduced circumstances to maintain the friendship. Now, I needed his expertise, and I hoped he wouldn't hold my pride against me. I called his office, half expecting to be blown off. Instead, his assistant put me through immediately. "Shanice," Terrence's warm baritone filled my ear. "I was wondering when I'd hear from you. How are you holding up?" "I've been better," I admitted. "Terrence, I need help, legal help, and I need to know if what I'm planning is even possible before I go down this road." "Tell me what's going on," he said, his voice shifting into professional mode. So I did. I told him about the engagement, about the Beaumonts, about the overheard conversation. I told him about my research, about my suspicions, about the plan forming in my mind. He listened without interrupting, occasionally making small sounds of acknowledgement. When I finished, there was a long pause. "Shanice," he said finally, "what you're describing is going to be complicated, expensive, and risky. If we're wrong about any part of this, you could face serious legal consequences. Are you absolutely sure you want to go down this road?" "I'm sure," I said, my voice steady. "They're trying to steal my husband's legacy and manipulate my son into betraying everything he's worked for. I'm not going to let that happen." "All right," Terrence said, and I could hear the smile in his voice. "Bernard always said you were tougher than you looked. Let me do some research, make some calls. Can you come to my office tomorrow afternoon?" "I'll be there," I promised. That meeting with Terrence lasted 3 hours. He brought in an associate who specialized in corporate law, and together we went through every detail of the situation, every document I'd collected, every piece of the plan. By the end, we had a strategy. It wasn't without risks, but it was solid. More importantly, it would expose the Beaumonts' true intentions in a way that couldn't be denied or explained away. "I'm going to be honest with you," Terrence said as I was leaving. "This is going to get ugly. The Beaumonts aren't going to take this line down. Are you prepared for that?" "After what they were planning to do to my son," I said, "I'm prepared for anything." The next 2 weeks were the hardest of my life. Harder than the weeks after Bernard's death, harder than those first desperate months trying to keep the factory afloat. Because I had to pretend. I had to act like I knew nothing, like I suspected nothing. I had to smile at Nicolette when she came to the factory. I had to discuss wedding plans with Vivian. I had to watch my son wrestle with his conscience and not say a word to comfort him or guide him. Every instinct I had as a mother screamed at me to pull him aside, to tell him what I knew, to talk him through this. But I couldn't. Not yet. If I revealed what I knew too early, they would simply adjust their strategy. They would wait, bide their time, attack from a different angle. No, I needed them committed, needed them to make moves. They couldn't take back. DeShawn was clearly struggling. I watched him over dinner one night, picking at his food, his face drawn. "Mom," he said finally, setting down his fork, "can I ask you something?" My heart seized. This was it. He was going to tell me about the sale, was going to ask my permission or try to justify it. I took a breath, kept my face open and calm. "Of course, baby, what's on your mind? Do you ever wish you'd made different choices after Dad died?" The question surprised me. It wasn't what I'd been expecting. "What do you mean?" I asked carefully. "I mean, you gave up your teaching career. You threw yourself into the factory even though you'd never wanted to be in business. Do you ever regret that? Do you ever wish you'd just sold it and moved on with your life? There it was, the groundwork being laid, the testing of waters. Nicolette had been coaching him on how to approach this conversation. I could practically hear her voice in his questions. Honestly, I said, choosing my words with care, sometimes. Those first 2 years especially, I questioned my decision constantly. It would have been easier to sell, to take whatever money I could get and start over. DeShawn leaned forward, hope lighting his face. But, I continued, I don't regret it. Not for a second. Because the factory isn't just about money or ease. It's about honoring what your father built. It's about the 32 people who depend on us for their livelihoods. It's about proving to myself that I was stronger than I thought. And most importantly, it's about working alongside you, watching you grow into the kind of man your father would be proud of. DeShawn's face crumpled slightly. What if I'm not that man, Mom? What if I can't live up to what you and Dad need me to be? DeShawn, I said gently, reaching across the table to take his hand. You already are that man. You've worked harder than anyone I know. You've sacrificed so much. Your father would be so proud of you, and so am I. I saw tears well up in his eyes. I love you, Mom. I love you too, baby, I said. More than you'll ever know, and I trust you. Whatever decisions you need to make about your future, I trust that you'll make them for the right reasons. It nearly broke me to say those words, knowing what I knew, knowing what he was contemplating. But I needed him to hear them. I needed him to carry them into whatever conversation he was going to have with Nicolette next, whatever decision he was working toward. Because when this all came out, when the truth was revealed, I needed him to remember that I had trusted him, that I had believed in him even when he was prepared to betray me. After that conversation, I could barely sleep. I kept seeing DeShawn's face, the guilt and conflict written so clearly across it. My baby boy, torn between his mother and his future wife, between his father's legacy and his own ambitions. The Beaumonts had put him in an impossible position, and they'd done it deliberately, coldly as a business strategy. For that alone, I would make them pay. 3 days before the wedding, Terrence called me. Everything's in place, he said. The timing is going to be tight, but we can make it work. Are you still sure about this? I'm sure, I said. Then let's do it, he replied. And Shanice, give them hell. The wedding was being held at the Beaumont estate, a lavish affair with over 200 guests. I arrived early, as was expected of the groom's mother, wearing a dress I'd spent too much money on and trying to project a calm I absolutely didn't feel. The grounds had been transformed into something out of a magazine, with white chairs arranged in perfect rows, flowers everywhere, a string quartet playing soft classical music. Money, everywhere I looked, there was money. Vivian greeted me with her usual air kisses. Shanice, don't you look lovely, she said, in that tone that suggested the opposite. Thank you, I replied with a smile. You've done a beautiful job with everything. It's like a fairy tale. Only the best for our Nicolette, Vivian said, and I didn't miss the emphasis on our. She deserves perfection. And so does DeShawn, I added pleasantly. Vivian's smile tightened just slightly. Of course, she agreed. Both of them deserve the best start to their new life together. New life. If only she knew how right she was, though not in the way she imagined. I made my way through the pre-ceremony mingling, playing my role perfectly. I hugged DeShawn when I saw him, handsome in his tuxedo but pale with nerves. You okay, baby? I whispered. Yeah, he said, but his eyes told a different story. Mom, I need to tell you something. After the wedding, after the honeymoon, we need to have a family meeting. There's something important Nick and I need to discuss with you. Of course, I said, still smiling. Whenever you're ready. His relief was palpable. He thought he had more time. He thought he could enjoy his wedding day, his honeymoon, before dropping the bomb. He had no idea that the bomb was about to explode in a very different direction. The ceremony was scheduled for 4 o'clock. At 3:30, as guests were beginning to take their seats, a black sedan pulled up the long driveway. 2 men in suits got out, carrying briefcases. I watched from the window of the bridal preparation room as they approached Reginald Beaumont, who was greeting late arrivals. I saw Reginald's expression change, saw him glance around before leading the men toward a side entrance of the house. Perfect. Right on schedule. At 3:45, just 15 minutes before the ceremony was supposed to start, all hell broke loose. I heard raised voices coming from inside the house, heard Reginald shouting. Then Vivian appeared, her perfect composure shattered, her face pale. "There's been a terrible mistake," she announced to the assembled guests, her voice shaken. "We need to delay the ceremony briefly. Please enjoy the refreshments. We'll begin shortly." The murmuring started immediately, confusion rippling through the crowd. I stayed where I was, watching. A few minutes later, Terrence appeared at my elbow. "It's done," he said quietly. "The sheriff has served the papers. Reginald Beaumont is officially being sued for fraud and breach of fiduciary duty by 3 separate parties whose properties he acquired under false pretenses. The injunction freezes all his assets pending investigation." And, I asked, "And about 20 minutes ago, 3 of his biggest creditors simultaneously called their loans. He's overleveraged, Shanice. Way overleveraged. Unless he can liquidate assets immediately, which he can't because of the injunction, he's looking at bankruptcy." I should have felt triumphant. Instead, I just felt tired. "Thank you, Terrence." "There's more," he said. When the sheriff served the papers, Reginald apparently said something about how this was all suspiciously timed, how someone must have been coordinating with his business rivals. That's when Nicolette apparently put 2 and 2 together. She's in the house right now with her father, and from what I'm hearing, it's not pretty. Before I could respond, DeShawn came rushing out, his face a mask of confusion and anger. "Mom, what's going on? Nicolette's father is being sued. The wedding might be canceled. Nobody will tell me anything." "I think," I said carefully, "you should go talk to your fiancée. I suspect she has quite a bit to tell you." He stared at me, and I saw the moment comprehension began to dawn. "Mom, what did you do?" "Go talk to Nicolette," I repeated. "And then, if you still want to, we can talk." He turned and ran back into the house. I stood in the garden, surrounded by confused wedding guests and melting ice sculptures, and waited. It didn't take long, maybe 20 minutes. Then DeShawn came back out, and I knew from his face that everything had changed. He walked toward me slowly, like a man in a daze. "She told me," he said, his voice hollow. "She told me everything. About the plan to buy the factory, about her father's offer, about how they'd been positioning all of this from the beginning." "I know," I said gently. "I know, baby. I overheard you 2 talking in the conference room 3 weeks ago." He staggered slightly, and I reached out to steady him. "You knew? This whole time you knew?" "I knew," I confirmed. "And you didn't say anything? You let me keep going, keep lying to you." "I needed you to see for yourself," I said. "If I'd just told you, you wouldn't have believed me. Or you would have believed Nicolette's explanation, whatever story she spun. You needed to see the truth yourself." "But how? How did you know to do all this, to sue her father, to time it for today?" "I didn't sue him," I clarified. "I just did some research, found some of his previous victims, connected them with a very good lawyer, and suggested they might want to coordinate their actions for maximum impact. Everything that's happening to Reginald Beaumont, he brought on himself through his own shady business practices. I just helped bring it to light." DeShawn sank onto a nearby bench, his head in his hands. "I almost did it, Mom. I almost signed the papers. She had them drawn up, ready to go. We were going to present them to you as a done deal when we got back from the honeymoon." The pain in his voice gutted me. I sat beside him, put my arm around his shoulders like I used to when he was small, and the world seemed overwhelming. "But you didn't," I said firmly. "You hesitated, you questioned. You couldn't quite bring yourself to go through with it, even with all the pressure she was putting on you. That tells me everything I need to know about who you are, DeShawn. You're your father's son. You're a good man." "I'm a fool," he said bitterly. "I almost destroyed everything for someone who was just using me." "You fell in love," I said. "That doesn't make you a fool, it makes you human. And yes, you almost made a terrible mistake, but almost doesn't count. You didn't do it. That's what matters." We sat there for a long moment, surrounded by the ruins of what was supposed to be his wedding day. Finally, he asked, "What do I do now, Mom?" "You walk away," I said simply. "You hold your head up, and you walk away from people who saw you as nothing more than an asset to be acquired. And then you come home, and we rebuild. Together, like we always have." He nodded slowly, then stood. "I need to go talk to her. End this properly. Do you want me to come with you?" I asked. "No," he said. "I need to do this myself, but Mom—" He turned back to look at me. "I'm sorry, I'm so sorry I even considered it." "I know, baby," I said. "I know." I watched him walk back into the house, his shoulders squared despite everything. My son, my beautiful, imperfect human son, he would heal from this. It would take time, but he would heal. And maybe in the end, he would be stronger for it. The wedding, unsurprisingly, was canceled. Guests were sent home with profuse apologies and no real explanation. Over the next few days, the full extent of the Beaumonts' financial troubles became clear. Reginald's empire was indeed a house of cards, and removing just one card, freezing his assets at a critical moment, had brought the whole thing tumbling down. He would likely avoid criminal charges, his lawyers were too good for that, but his reputation was destroyed. Bankruptcy proceedings were initiated. The mansion would have to be sold. Vivian, I heard through the grapevine, was beside herself. Nicolette called DeShawn once, a few days after the canceled wedding. I wasn't there for the conversation, but DeShawn told me about it later. She'd tried to explain, to justify, to suggest that they could still make it work if he would just listen to reason. "I told her there was nothing left to say," DeShawn said. "She saw me as a business opportunity, not a partner. That's not love. That's not marriage. That's a transaction." "How do you feel?" I asked him. "Angry," he admitted. "Hurt, stupid, but also weirdly relieved, like I just avoided stepping off a cliff I didn't even see coming." We dove back into the factory work, both of us using it as therapy. The steady rhythm of production, the concrete problems to solve, the satisfaction of shipping orders and satisfying clients, it all helped. Marcus, our production manager, never asked for details about what had happened, but he gave DeShawn extra patience and grace during those weeks, which I appreciated more than I could say. 3 months after the canceled wedding, something unexpected happened. A boutique fashion house in New York, one we'd been courting for years without success, reached out. They were looking for a new fabric supplier, someone who could provide quality American-made materials with quick turnaround times. Were we interested? We were very interested. DeShawn and I went to New York together for the meetings. We pitched them hard, showed them samples, talked about our capacity and our commitment to quality. We landed the contract. It was the biggest client we'd ever had, the kind of account that would take us from stable to actually growing. "Dad would be so proud," DeShawn said, as we celebrated with overpriced cocktails in our mediocre hotel bar. "He is," I said. "Wherever he is, he's proud of both of us." "Even after what I almost did?" DeShawn asked, the guilt still lingering in his eyes. "Especially after what you almost did," I said firmly. "Because you learned from it. You grew. That's all any of us can do, baby. We make mistakes, we learn, we do better next time." A year later, the factory was thriving. We'd hired 10 new workers. We'd upgraded some key equipment. We'd paid off our highest interest loans. DeShawn was dating someone new, a woman who worked in logistics and appreciated the complexity of what we did without trying to change it or exploit it. She was good for him, and more importantly, he was happy. As for me, I was exactly where I needed to be, running a business I'd never intended to run, doing work I'd never imagined myself doing, but doing it well. Honoring Bernard's memory not by preserving the past like a museum piece, but by building on it, growing it, taking it into the future. The Beaumonts disappeared from our lives as completely as they'd entered it. Reginald's bankruptcy was finalized. They sold the mansion and moved to a much smaller place across town. Vivian resigned from most of her board positions. Nicolette, I heard, had moved to another city entirely, starting over somewhere her family's disgrace wasn't common knowledge. I didn't feel triumphant about their downfall. I didn't gloat. I'd done what I needed to do to protect my son and our business, but I took no pleasure in their suffering. Mostly, I just felt grateful. Grateful that I'd found out when I did, grateful that I'd had the strength to act, grateful that DeShawn had ultimately made the right choice, even if it had been a near thing. The factory still wasn't easy. We still had challenges, still had months where money was tight, still had equipment breakdowns and difficult clients and all the normal stresses of running a small business. But it was ours, built on honest work and real relationships and mutual respect. And that, I'd learned, was worth more than all the Beaumont money combined. Sometimes late at night when I couldn't sleep, I'd walk through the quiet factory floor, running my hand along the machines Bernard had loved, breathing in the familiar smell of fabric and dye. I'd think about the path that had brought me here, the choices I'd made, the battles I'd fought. I'd think about the woman I'd been 5 years ago, the high school teacher who'd never run a business, never stood up to wealthy bullies, never orchestrated a takedown of people who thought themselves untouchable. That woman felt like a stranger now. I'd been forged in fire, reshaped by necessity and loss and determination. I'd discovered reserves of strength I never knew I possessed. I'd learned that sometimes the greatest act of love is not protecting someone from their mistakes, but allowing them to see those mistakes clearly enough to choose a different path. I'd learned that revenge and justice can sometimes look very similar, but the difference lies in your motivations. I hadn't destroyed the Beaumonts out of spite or cruelty. I'd simply revealed who they already were, let their own actions speak for themselves. Standing in that factory, Bernard's legacy surrounding me, our son's future secured, I felt something I hadn't felt in years, peace. Not happiness exactly, though there were moments of that too, but peace. The deep satisfaction of knowing I'd fought the right battles, made the right choices, protected what mattered most. The factory hummed in the darkness, machinery on standby, waiting for tomorrow's production. And I stood there, Shanice Shaw, former teacher, current factory owner, always and forever a mother protecting her child. And I smiled, because sometimes the best revenge isn't destroying your enemies. It's simply refusing to be destroyed by them. It's building something good and strong and real, despite their best efforts to tear it down. It's standing your ground when everyone expects you to fold. It's proving that wisdom and experience and determination can triumph over money and manipulation and social status. The Beaumonts had underestimated me from the beginning. They'd seen a middle-aged widow struggling to keep a small business afloat and assumed I'd be easy to push aside, easy to trick, easy to defeat. They'd been so focused on the factory as an asset to acquire that they'd forgotten I was a person to be reckoned with. They'd played chess while I was playing a longer, more patient game, and in the end, they destroyed themselves far more thoroughly than I ever could have destroyed them. I left the factory as the sun was beginning to rise, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new orders to fill, new problems to solve. But tonight, right now, everything was exactly as it should be. My son was safe. Our business was secure. The people who tried to steal from us had been exposed and defeated, and I, improbably, impossibly, had become exactly the person I needed to be. As I drove home through the empty streets, I thought about all the women like me, women who found themselves thrust into situations they never chose, forced to become people they never imagined being. Women who discovered that strength isn't about never being afraid or never being hurt. It's about being afraid, being hurt, and doing what needs to be done anyway. It's about transforming pain into purpose, betrayal into determination, vulnerability into power. The Beaumonts had tried to write my story for me, to cast me as the obstacle in their path, the minor character, to be written out of the narrative. But they'd forgotten the most important rule of storytelling: never underestimate the supporting character. Because sometimes when you're not paying attention, that supporting character becomes the hero of their own story. And that's exactly what I had become. Please tell me what you thought of the story in the comments below. And if you like this tale, please subscribe to the channel. It helps me to keep creating these wonderful stories. Until tomorrow, all my love.